please.
Yeah.
Is it still morning? Yeah, good morning. Thanks for coming to this. I'm Gregory Thompson. This is Robert Edwards, my colleague, and we work with an organization called Voices Underground. The topic of this particular seminar is on how to create a memorial, and we don't have all the answers to that. We don't even have most of the answers to that because we're still in the process of creating the memorial. So what we thought we would do is walk you through the process that we've gone through and just let you interact with that. We're going to present for just a period of time, and then we'll have time for questions and for you to tell your own stories and things like that. So the first question that we had to ask was, why are we telling stories? Like, why are we doing that? And our name comes from the story actually in the Torah. It's a story of two brothers, each given different gifts, and yet those differences became a source of conflict, and Cain, as you know, kills his brother Abel. And that's the first crime passage in the Torah. God comes to Cain and says to him, "Where's your brother?" And you know the very famous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Those are probably the most famous words from that passage. But they're not the most important. The most important words are what comes next, where God says to Cain, "I heard your brother's blood crying out from the ground." And the idea here, this is the first justice passage in the Torah. And it's a moment where somebody not only did an event, but tried to destroy the memory of that event, tried to hide the memory. And so part of what we learned from that passage is that justice begins with a form of memory. It begins with remembering and being willing to tell, to hear the stories, the blood crying out from the ground, and that really is where our name comes from, Voices Underground. Which means that our moral commitment is to telling the stories of, and listening to the stories first, and then telling the stories of people who've been subjected to harm and to violence, and doing that as an act of reparative justice. So that's kind of the moral framing for us. That's why we tell these stories, and that will obligate us to tell stories in a particular kind of way, to focus the stories in a particular kind of way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about toward the end of our time about how we're telling the stories, but because of our audience, it's and even in America, the stories that we're telling may not be well known. So Robert's going to spend some time just walking you through the story of the Underground Railroad and why we're telling that story, and then we'll talk about how we're doing it. So I'll turn to you.
Jack, you want to give a little context to like the memory?
Yeah, you gonna do that? Yeah. So sorry, one thing that we want to say before we get into that story is, like every place, we're doing memory work in a context, and I want you to see this. This map is really important. So, truth-telling. Okay, this is important. So here, truth-telling in the United States is a countercultural activity. For some of you who have been in German storytelling, German memory culture for many years, and you're in a culture where telling the truth, at least the form of the truth, is really important. Like even it's illegal to deny the Holocaust, things like that. There is no analogy to that in the United States. The United States is a culture and a country in active and ongoing self-deceit, willed self-deceit. And it's actually illegal in some places to get books that tell the stories that we're trying to tell about the truth that we're working with our colleagues to tell. The important thing about this is these dots represent memorials, and this rise, you see the radical rise in memorialization developing really starting in the 1890s and going to the 1920s. That is at the generation, that is coterminous with the rise of Jim Crow segregations in the South. So these memorials that dominate the United States landscape, it would be the equivalent, it would be our equivalent of having after World War II, if Germany had gone into a mode of building memorials to Nazis everywhere. These are to Confederate soldiers, people who own slaves. They are in every community, thousands of them, and there are less than, let's say, I don't have exactly, maybe it says it up here, but it's something like, if you look at the memorialization, this was a survey of 50,000 memorials in the United States. If you look at that, it's 94% of those memorials are to white people, to people that America deems white. 90% of them are to males. 33% of them celebrate military engagements, even military loss, so a Confederate loss. So that's the kind of memory culture that we're working in. There's a deep aversion to telling the truth, and as all of you know now, we have a presidential candidate whose chief characteristic is his pathological addiction to deceit. And so that, but understand that he's not an anomaly. He's merely the most grotesque and absurd embodiment of a larger cultural phenomenon of brazen deceit. And this tells you what we're working against. Because if you want to know the memorials to African American history, if you want to know the memorials to women, there's just no analogy to what is here. No comparison. So that's a little bit about the context. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you. And it's a little hard to read on this backdrop, but these spikes occur every time there's progress in Black society, Black culture. And so that was their response to our advancement. And so at Voices Underground, we were trying to figure out how can we respond to that counter narrative. Next slide, please. So thinking about the Underground Railroad and the movement of Black people, we didn't want to just start from slavery to freedom, but we wanted to start before slavery, because there was a movement of Black people prior to slavery. And to show these mobility patterns, we thought it was important to think about the transatlantic slave trade and what that meant in the context of moving bodies through different landscapes. Next slide. And so the Underground Railroad, to those who aren't familiar, was a movement. It was a form of resistance during slavery, when enslaved people would escape from out of slavery to flee to northern states or spaces where they wouldn't be enslaved. And a part of that Underground Railroad is this invisible network of not just people moving and escaping, fleeing slavery, but there were people called conductors who helped them, who guided them to freedom, station masters who worked under invisibility to maintain safe spaces so these people could stop, rest, eat, move, gather goods, and then move to the next station. And that's why it's called the Underground Railroad. It wasn't underground, and it wasn't by train, although some freedom seekers traveled by train. It's called the Underground Railroad because it was this invisible network, but also because the language that was used mirrored trains over the railroad.
Yeah, on this map, I want you just to note the dotted line up there at the top, right? We're gonna come back to that. That's where our work is. That border right there between communities of slavery and communities of relative freedom, it was crossing that border, and being in Berlin, which is a city that for many years had its own border. So just connect to that, because that's where our work is, and we'll come back to that.
The next slide will zoom in a little bit on where our work is and why it's important. If you saw in the previous slide, a lot of those arrows are going to where our work is focused. It's for a reason. It's because Pennsylvania was a free state, became a free state early on in American history, and is right there by Maryland and Delaware, which were slave states. So once you crossed over into Pennsylvania, you were technically free, or considered free, even though slave catchers would follow them into free states. But this is that line where you experience a sense of freedom in the landscape, and that's the story that we're trying to tell, of not just invisible landscape or invisible networks, but invisible landscapes. And if you see the dotted line that says Kennett Square, in this region right here is Chester County, and that's where our work focuses mostly on. And Wilmington, you see Wilmington, Delaware, and then Maryland over here. Next slide, please. And so at VU, we not only want to tell stories that are rooted in experiences, but also rooted in scholarship. And we spend a lot of time in many different archives, and we define archives very differently than in traditional academia. We find primary resources, secondary resources, but we also collect oral histories where we look at music, poems, different things to gather these stories, art, and we look at other historical archival materials to inspire our work. We also challenge the archive by doing that, to tell a more impactful story. Next slide, please. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, so along the border, and you have analogies in your own German context. There were people who created communities of resistance along the border. There are African American communities. It's important to understand that there are free Black communities that are driving a lot of the abolition of slavery. That are driving this. There are white communities that are largely religious in nature. There are women, there are men. So we're crossing not only like gender, race, religion, political jurisdictions. It's a boundary crossing collaboration. So a lot of our work is trying to explore the meaning of the boundaries and the borders between us, and what does it mean to cross those together in the interest of freedom. And so a lot of the people that we are focused on were working in these areas. So you can go to the next slide.
It was a very interracial movement, so it's not just free Black people. In this region, there were white Quakers and some Black Quakers as well. Quakers in 1776 outlawed owning enslaved Black people or enslaving Black people, and so that inspired a lot of the abolitionism in this region here. Does anyone know the line? If you look inside my soul, you will find gold and maybe be rich. I'm giving away a free card if someone Yes, you get a free card. Well, that's a lot. That's a reference to Plato's. In all of us, we have precious gems, and that's what inspired the Quakers. All of us have the light inside of us, and that's why they couldn't enslave humans. And so when we think about that in today's context, and we listen to hip hop, these things pop up, and that's how I'm thinking about reaching different communities, younger groups, people who may not be jazzed about history. Think about this line in a different way, and how does that appear in Quakerism? Justin also talks about music and how important music is, so that was just a nod to Justin. But thinking, next slide please. Thinking about some of the key figures that we think about when we think of the Underground Railroad, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, these people were going through Kennett Square, not just as active members of the Underground Railroad, but speaking like we're speaking today about the movement. Next slide. I'm gonna talk about Still.
Yeah, so William Still was the what was called the station master in Philadelphia, and honestly most of what we know about the Underground Railroad comes from history that was not exactly history. I don't know how you would describe it, but it's basically when people would come, freedom seekers would come through, they would inevitably be brought to him for help. So he could connect them to other people to get them out, even out of Philadelphia. Philadelphia had the largest African American community in the United States until say 1790. Free black community, I mean. And then that began to move to places like New York, and so he was helping people move along. But he wrote, it's roughly 800 pages of records of his encounters with people who came to him, recording their stories, how they got there, what their original names were, what their new names would be, things like that. So he's a really important figure in this area. Go to the next slide.
And so Still is in Philly, Thomas Garrett is in Delaware, and they're partners in crime. So when an enslaved person or a freedom seeker reaches Thomas Garrett, he sends them to William Still in Philly as the next station point. And sometimes they would stop in Kennett Square. Most of the time they would stop in Kennett Square. But the two of them are writing to each other. And as Greg mentioned, William Still is collecting all of these stories, all of these names from these freedom seekers. Next slide. And these are just some of the names collected.
Are these the names that they adopted, or the names that they had when they came, or both?
These are just the names that were documented in this book, yeah.
Thank you.
And where they come from, their age, but some of them didn't have documented names.
Okay, next slide. Yeah, so these are just to give you a sense of there are freedom seekers, and this will be important when we think about memorialization. There are black abolitionists, there are freedom seekers, then there are the white allies that are around, and that's a part of the story. So these are just some of those faces. These people were many of them were neighbors, distant neighbors with one another who would help, and they were all a part of this together. So you can go to the next slide.
Wait, hold on.
Sorry.
Go back to the previous slide. One thing I want to mention is that we're focusing on the black perspective, considering the black experience, the black perspective. But if you notice, the title on this page is very close. The lines are very tight. A few slides ago, we looked at a slave ship where the bodies were right real tight, closely together. That's why we purposely put those words together tight, so that we can symbolize that we're telling the story of the black people who were enslaved. And when we're on this page, the reason why the Quakers or the white allies are on the second page is because we want to remind people that we're focusing on or centering the black perspective. So we've been talking about memorials for the last couple of days. Toni Morrison had this quote, which I won't read, let you guys read it, but in response to the lack of memorials to black people in America, she started this campaign where they would install benches on the side of the road for black people to reflect on black history. And so one of the sites that we're looking at, or that we're affiliated with and we work with, Lincoln University, which is one of the first HBCUs in the country, there is a Toni Morrison bench in front of the Hosanna Church, which is significant to not only the Underground Railroad, but to the Civil War, because there are United States colored troop soldiers buried in the cemetery in this church. And so there's not only, the land isn't only sacred because it's the the first historically black college in America, but it's also tied to King, it's tied to slavery, the free black community, Civil War, Underground Railroad, all of those things. Its life is.
Yeah, so this is where we began to think about, okay, why we tell stories. There's a moral obligation. The story that we're telling is the story of the Underground Railroad, but really that needs to be centered on the freedom seeker, on the formerly enslaved people. Now the question became, how do we tell the story? How are we going to tell this story? And what I want to say, just as a general idea, is that one of the things that we're trying to do is create, I don't know what the German says, and I don't really know how to say anything in German, but especially is a creative ecosystem, like a series of access points for people to encounter the history that could even be isolated from one another, and I'll explain more what I mean. Like you can, just like the Underground Railroad was. So the Underground Railroad, the history has really determined our methodology. So it's collaborative, meaning it's not just like one person saying this is what we're gonna do and how we're gonna do it. So it's collaborative in nature. We're trying to figure out how do we cross all these borders and bring all these different people in the room. So we've been working on this for 7 years. And we're just now at the design of the memorial phase, and even our design team is a collaborative team, and I'll say more about that. But the idea of collaboration is, it can sound a little bit conventional, but it's really derived from the story itself. We thought, how do we, in our process, embody the collaborations of the Underground Railroad in a way that centers Black agency? Like, how do we do that? So you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about memorialization first. That's one of the big things that we're doing. We're working on the National Memorial to the Underground Railroad. There are 3 sites. One of those is Lincoln University. Robert mentioned a few months ago an HBCU. That's a university that was specifically established for the training of African Americans. This one was established before the Civil War in the 1850s. Complicated history, but that is a deep engine of Black abolitionism. So at Lincoln University, we're telling the story, the Black abolitionist story. Frederick Douglass preached there, the cemetery is there, the church is there, Martin Luther King preached there. But there's also a home in which Stokely Carmichael wrote the book Black Power. All of those are right next to each other. And so we're telling that story of the Black freedom movement there at Lincoln University. We've also started a research center there called the Center for Public History. And I just finished a Mellon grant to create a concentration in Black liberation studies there, to try to figure out, like, how do we bring the church and the Black Powerhouse in dialogue with each other and inform the cultivation of a Black freedom movement. So that's part of it. So one of the sites we've determined it there. Another one is Longwood Gardens. Longwood Gardens is you maybe heard of the DuPont family. They were just a very wealthy industrial family. Their estate was turned into one of the largest botanical gardens in the United States. Outside of the gates of the botanical garden, they own Longwood Meeting House, which was a Quaker meeting house that was created because of abolitionism. They own this thing called the Cox House, where many of the freedom seekers that you saw their names listed stayed there. And they own a cemetery, and that is where we're largely going to be telling the white religious abolitionist story. And then there's a third site, which is a landscape story. Now, here's why. We realized pretty early on that when you tell the Underground Railroad story from the perspective of buildings, it becomes a white savior story. It's like, look at the white people that hosted the Black people in their homes. It becomes even a class story. So we thought, what was the experience of a freedom seeker? It wasn't buildings. And when you go into, if you tell it through buildings, it largely portrays Black people in terms of confinement. They're in small spaces, they're hiding, they're behind walls, they're under floors. And that is not that is not the full truth. And you know, we were reckoning with this yesterday about how so much of Jewish identity in Germany and the things that we've seen is often portrayed in terms of your hands up in the ghetto, you know, rather than all of the other forms of Jewish agency and brilliance and beauty that need to be foregrounded. So that was a really deep concern for us. How is this a Black agency story and not just Black aid, like aid coming to Black people? So the landscape allows us to tell the story from the perspective of a freedom seeker. And so we've been looking at sites, multiple hundreds of acres sites, where you can go through fields, forests, cross water, and you can actually cross the border. You can have that experience of moving from Delaware into Pennsylvania as the border crossing, which ties to this mobility. So that's a lot. There are a lot of words there. So we can skip.
If you go to the next slide, this allows you to see not just the agency, but the imagination of the freedom seeker and what they had to endure, because they're not just walking through mowed lawns. This is rough woodlands, swamps, and the ability to read topography, astrology, nature, how do you survive in the woods is, that's magical. You wanna add anything?
Yeah. These will be some of the concerns. You know, what is this site historically significant? What are the zoning or legal prohibitions? Can people with different levels of accessibility and mobility get there? What's the impact? You know, all of those things are a part of this. You can go to the next slide.
I'm trying not to nerd out and design stuff and like, hit you guys with that stuff, but also looking at sites, what is safe for Black people? You know, again, asking the question, who is this memorial for? And will Black visitors feel safe visiting a site like this?
So this is just these are images of the Lincoln University site. That's the church where Frederick Douglass preached. So if you look here, that's the church. Right there is the house where Stokely Carmichael wrote Black Power. Right there is the chapel where Martin Luther King preached. And this is the campus of the first HBCU in the United States. So the idea is to take this section of the campus and turn it into the memorial that's celebrating Black liberation. And you can see, if I move my massive head, that that the cemetery, the gravestones are falling over. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to identify and to restore that cemetery. That will be a part of the ongoing thing. So
The Tony Morrison bench is right here.
Yeah. This is a Longwood Garden site. So this is the Cox House. That is. So you can see here, the gardens are kind of over in this top left corner. Our site goes from there all the way up to that building, where the cemetery is in here. So this is the section where we're trying to tell the Quaker abolitionist story and really look at some of the religious underpinnings of the movement. This is the Cox House. Now you'll see that it's right on a highway. That was just, in the past few months, it was moved about 100 yards this way. Weirdly, that meant that the basement had to stay in its original site, but the rest of the house moved. So we're trying to figure out if there are ways to, because the state was going to they have to widen the road. So we have to figure out, is there a way that we can access the remains of that basement and then redeploy it in some way?
I also have to work with archaeologists to find out how the basement was used as a safe space.
Yeah. All right, next. And this is when we talk about the landscape site, this is what we're talking about. We have a number. I don't know how many of these particular spots we have. Is this the only? Yeah. So you should imagine that there's. I mean, obviously this is farmland. There's pathways through the field. And again, we don't know what this design is going to be. It's not just going to be a walk through a field. It's our idea is to really actually change landscapes in some important ways to give people access to move through it. To use a lot of design elements to evoke the story. But we have the next 2 years is when our design phase, we just started it. We just got grant funding for the next 2 years for this process. And again, this is not funded by the government. These are private foundations and individuals that are funding this largely. And so this will give you kind of a vision of what we're talking about. And the idea is these 3 sites are within about 6 miles of one another. So it would be possible to do all of those in a day if you were bringing students or something like that. And then reflect on the various experiences.
And all 3 will be different.
Yeah, they'll all be different. Go ahead. Okay, but here's another thing. So the memorial is one thing, but we also are trying to create other experiences. You don't have to. We mostly wanted to show you the images here. Let's see, what's the one after this? Yeah. So one of the things we do is, if you think of our work in terms of research, experiences, and memorialization, we've talked a little bit about the research center at Lincoln University. We're trying to do a digital archive. We're working with African American interns, students. We're trying to create a concentration in public history, and see if we could do that, because we really wanted to center the research side of this in a Black institution. And so that's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project to do that we've just started. We just brought our first faculty member in, and with 3 years of funding this past year. So research is a part of it. Memorialization we've talked about. The experiences are another part of this that is, I think, a thing that people are often most surprised by and intrigued by. What you're looking at in the top left here is a restaurant that we're opening. It's called Star and Lantern. And why are we opening a restaurant? The idea here is that Underground Railroad had at its heart hospitality as a civic act. The idea of being welcomed into someone's home and being fed and being nurtured. And so part of it is driven by that. And I can say a little bit more about the art in a moment, but we wanted people to be able to come into the restaurant, and then just the drinks are all named after. The drinks are taken from. There's a book by an African American man named Tom Bullock who published a cocktail book in 1917. He was formerly enslaved. So we're using Tom Bullock's recipes as the basis of what we're doing. And we have 46 custom cocktails that are named after things in the Underground Railroad. So if you come in and you say, I would like the Christiana burning, please. Where does that name come from? We're like, well, actually, this is from the Christiana, murder that happened. We want to talk about that. Or this is the Havre de Grace. Like, why is it named that? Well, that means Harbor of Grace, and it's from a town just over, and this is what happened there. And so we have an old fashioned named after William Still. So there are things like that we're doing. The food is a combination of African American food, historic food, and Quaker foodways. I know more about Quaker food than 19th century Quaker food than anyone else I know, because we had to figure out how to compose dishes that used Quaker food and also African American foodways. So I can say to people, the Underground Railroad was a collaboration between Quakers and African Americans. Or we can let you taste that collaboration and create sensory memories around that. That's part of the idea.
And it's also the food that was eaten by freedom seekers.
Yeah.
So you get to experience that as well, that moment.
Yeah. Like with the industrialization of foodways, a lot of the different kind of seeds that were available have diminished, but we're working with African American seed savers in Pennsylvania to pull those heirloom grains out and tomatoes and okra, strands of okra out. And this will be a place where one of the few places where you can actually taste those things. But there are a lot of people, as you know, who don't care about this at all. They just want good food. They want a good cocktail. And so what we wanted to do was create the best cocktail bar in the region so that people who care about that want to come. But when they come, they have an 8-foot tall portrait of Harriet Tubman standing over them. Most people in the United States, I don't think this is exaggeration, will never have been to a restaurant where almost all the faces on the wall are Black. And so they'll come in because they want the food or they want the cocktails, but the story is beginning to operate on them, which is how we think art and beauty and sensory memories work. So next slide. We also do a bunch of, pretty much everything we do is, well, many things we do are food-based. One, because that's true to the Underground Railroad. Two, because we think that we're sowing a vision of democratic life into what the idea where you're bringing your abundance to a common place for the nourishing and well-being of folks. So every year we have a festival in June, and we have a table called Freedom's Table where we set up, several hundred people will come. We are focusing on Black chefs. We have music, all these kind of things. So this just gives you a sense. So there's the research, there's memorialization, there's the experiences. You can go to the next slide. So this is, I want to just tell you a little bit about this painting. I reached out to Patrick Doer. I loved his work, and I said, do you do commissions? And he said no. And I said, well, can you just have a conversation with me about it? At the end of the conversation, he was like, I will do this commission. We talked about, I said, we need to do, this is a Black glory story. This is a Black triumph story. And we came up with the idea to paint Harriet Tubman as a saint. But the robe, her robe is made out of passages from the book of Exodus. And also runaway slave advertisements. And you'll see, if like on her left elbow, the folds in her robe were created with the slave ship diagram. And this is gold leaf. And so when you go into the restaurant, there's what we call the Cloud of Witnesses wall, where it's got all of these people from Chester County and from the larger region, Lincoln University students, all these amazing photographs and paintings that we've commissioned. You go in, you see the bar, it's just, 25 feet tall, beautiful bar, and then to the left, presiding over the whole thing is Harriet Tubman. And so these are just some of the ways that we're experimenting. Like, is it possible to do this? Yeah.
Did you, just for those who were thinking Jewishly, her name was Moses, like they called Harriet Tubman Moses. And so Exodus being the passage that's in her code is like extremely connective for our Black community and our Jewish community, and I happen to be both. So
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, thank you. Now, lots we could say about the painting, but if you go to the next slide, this is what the space looks like. That's the logo. It's called Star and Lantern. It's named after the stars that the freedom seekers followed and the lanterns that welcomed them in. So we wanted to be able to tell both of those stories. I love the logo, and one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how to create. This is in a way that it's not similar to the Stumbling Stones, but a way to create iconography out of that. Like, there's no signage for this cocktail bar. There's no sign that says Star and Lantern this way. There's just going to be that icon in the middle of the door. But we also want to put those in different spaces, because a longer term vision and hope that we have is to be able to connect, like the Camino de Santiago, like where there's the shell icon that goes throughout, huge stretches of Europe. We would like to be able to see something like that developed, and this may already be in the works somewhere else and we just don't know about it, around the Underground Railroad sites, where people can see that and recognize what it is. Because as you may know, the Underground Railroad just didn't go north into Pennsylvania and went south into the Caribbean and went south into Mexico. So there are all kinds of really interesting ways to tell this story, but we wanted to create the first space at the border at this moment. So, and anyway, sorry, this is a building that was owned by one of those families, the Quaker families. This was owned by them. It's a 19th century building, which in America is very old. So we had Amish stonemasons repoint all the stone, and this is before we did construction. Where we don't have any of those photos to show yet because we're in it right now. But is that it? Is that the last one?
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you. Yeah, I think we're up for questions, right?
Yeah. How much time do we have for questions?
3 hours.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Perfect.
I
I know lunch is gonna be ready around 12. Why don't we say we can go till 10 after, so we have about 15 minutes.
Do you mind capping that one?
Yeah, I can actually just turn this off.
That was incredible. Thank you all for sharing. This is fascinating. You are doing an incredible job already. I have a lot of things to say, so you're just gonna have to be my friend. We have to talk about it later. But first, I really love that you use that Toni Morrison quote. I use that exact same quote in many, many, many of my presentations, and there's a bench in my exhibit that is inspired by that quote. So seeing that exact quote that I read a lot was very powerful for me personally. Thank you. Second, so you've been working on this project for a long time, and it's so clear the amount of thoroughness and care that you are pouring into it. My question is, I guess the context is that in my work, I feel so hurried to do all my projects because people have been waiting for so long for this kind of recognition. How do you grapple with both the urgency of this project and the time you need to put the care into it?
Do you want me?
Yeah, I'll just say I am very manic sometimes.
Very what?
Very manic. And yeah. And I want to see something happen now.
Yeah, same.
But I am a part of a team that holds me accountable, and I hold them accountable to make sure that this is done right. And that relieves some of that pressure.
Yeah, there was a lot of wind at our back after George Floyd. Like a lot of let's do this now. But I think we came to the conclusion that to do it like that would probably exclude community voices. It would probably it would give too much power to funders to determine the outcome. It would, and we thought 10 years of a process is not that long in the scope of national history to try to get it as right as you can. We know we're gonna get things wrong, and we know that other generations are gonna have to change what we did. That's one of the reasons for a landscape memorial is it's so powerful, is it changes seasonally, and we understand that control is an illusion. It is the lie that all of this has been built, all of white supremacy has been built on, and so you can't build control into your methodology. And so we just had to go slowly. But we have had moments that that feel like progress. I think people need to feel progress more than they need to feel final results. And so these moments of creating experiences of progress, I think, have been really, really helpful.
How do the two of you collaborate? What's your process? You both come, you're an architect, you're
Whatever.
whatever. But how do you do this together? And I know there are more people, but.
Yeah, what was that process?
Well, we met through a common friend. Robert was doing some work on comparing the Green Book to. Are you familiar with the Green Book? Anyone know it?
Probably should explain.
Yeah. Please, you want to explain it?
Sure. I wrote my master's thesis on architecture associated with the Negro Motorist Green Book, or was listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book, which was a book published from 1936 to 1966 by a New York City postal worker named Victor Hugo Green. And in this book, he listed different places, restaurants, bars, hotels, tourist homes where African Americans could stay during the era of Jim Crow segregation. And so I looked at architecture associated with this cultural landscape and compared it to architecture along the Underground Railroad, and looked at the two as architectural refuges for Black people and how they were needed during two very different cultural landscapes, but also how they're needed today and how we preserve these spaces. I wrote an article, I think Lewis.
Yeah, somebody sent it to me.
And then we connected, and
I think our collaboration process is a lot of conversation. It's what do you think about this? What do you think about that?
A lot of hard conversations.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of private conversations when we're working with our larger design team. Because weirdly, our role, we're not the designers of the memorial. I mean, we have input, but our role is really almost like a producer role, like a moral orientation role. Like, no, we're not doing that. Or, hey, your voice needs to be heard more. Can you know, more cowbell? You know, kind of like how do we get? So we're working on that, which means that while we're on Zoom calls or while we're in meetings, he and I are constantly texting each other, saying, "Did you hear what that dude just said? Do you want to address it or do you want me to address it?" It's like that, and so I think that it's also been born out of like a personal friendship, which has been really wonderful. So, but we're still figuring it out. Yeah.
I'm curious, you have 3 different sites, and what is the entry point gonna be for people, especially if somebody maybe doesn't, I don't know, they only have a little limited amount of time, maybe they're only going to one site, will there be a nod to the other sites and what they're missing from one particular site if that's their only access point?
We don't know yet. I think certainly there will be some sort of awareness that what you're standing in is one part of a larger narrative, and that there are ways to access that, but we don't really know what the like design elements of the connection are going to be, and yeah, I think that's really what the next 2 years is about.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to go there. I think for me, it's going to be a huge thing, which is great. I'm just wondering, the house or the buildings, the former Quaker buildings, and also the landscape where you can experience kind of crossing the border, they are probably privately owned or were, and I was wondering how did you come across to, like, do you own these places now? And how did the people that own them react to your project, and was there any
Yeah, that's part of why it's taken 7 years, and will take 5 more, is Lincoln University owns their property. They were the first people that I went to see when we first came up with this idea. I went and met with the president and said, I was working with Justin in Memphis at the time, showed her the musical that we worked on together and said, this is the kind of stuff we're doing. So we've still spent several years building that relationship, and just really in the past couple of years, in probably 22, she said, let's let Lincoln be a site. Longwood Gardens has really just this past year said that they want this to be a site and they want us to partner with them, even though they host events for us, all that kind of stuff. Their board is largely extremely wealthy white people who are DuPont family members. And they left the Underground Railroad assets outside of the garden for years. No, it boarded up. They don't use them in any way. So 7 years ago, we started pressing on them, like, you have this really important asset. And we also knew that they're a fairly like liberal institution, they're a cultural institution, and the one thing that a white liberal doesn't want to be accused of is being a racist. And so I was very happy to leverage that fear in order to say, like, this, you have this, you don't have any black people on your staff, you're not equipped to interpret this, how can we help you? How can we help solve this massive problem that you have? Yeah, but the third one we're actually working on right now. We don't know what the landscape site is going to be. There are 3 or 4 sites. I think we've mostly excluded privately held sites at this point. They're either held by a trust, I mean, that's still a private, well, yeah, that's not true. We're not trying to just get somebody to give us their land. So we're working with the thing called the Conservation Fund. They are an organization that they have like 9 million acres under management. They get land from owners and then put all these conservation protections on it and then transfer it to a steward. So we will probably have a long-term lease from a steward of that, because I think, but our board has not really made the decision as to whether we're gonna own. But I think we have to put the legal documents in place that allow us, to be the interpreters of the memorials, even if, and we'll essentially lease that land, the sites probably, yes.
Question is, it's around that, it's centered. So when I think of the work, brilliant, narrative shift work, and then I think of base building, right? And then I think of like some type of immediate public gain. My question is, so when you talk about the restaurant, right, the economics of that, you talk about tourism, are there conversations emergent around what it means when we talk about autonomy, like whose story it is, right? Are there conversations around how what is the public gain currently for the Black community? And are there conversations like economically as to how these things can benefit a specific base that you might be building?
Yeah, we have a strong, relationship with, the state and the state's tourism agency. So currently work with PA Tourism, but last year, I developed a website for them, that is a map essentially of Black-owned restaurants. And, they asked for, I think it was 10, I gave them 60. Alright, and then visited those restaurants and saw people there. And so those tourism, cause we live in a capitalistic society, those dollars are going into Black-owned businesses. And not just restaurants, now we're developing, a list of, artists, musicians, and other Black-owned businesses, to facilitate some of that, and also, so we're doing it from a financial point, but also a historical point, an awareness point, you know.
Yeah, one thing about that might be of interest to you is, 4 or 5 years ago, the state reached out to us and said, it was after George Floyd, they said, we don't do anything with African American tourism in Pennsylvania, what should we do? And as often happens, I was a white guy, and they felt safe calling me. And so I was like, well, let me figure it out. So we went back to them and said, what if we developed an African American tourism plan for the whole state that was based on African American sports, African American foodways, African American music, art, and culture, African American like civil rights history, and then you guessed it, the Underground Railroad. So I was getting them to fund our research work on the Underground Railroad, but also providing them. And so Robert's really been leading that project. So we're giving the state a list of Black-owned restaurants, museums, all of these things that can, so that's a macro level, Justin, but one of the things that we're doing right now, Star and Lantern, the financial model, is that all gets reinvested in the work. And then we hired there's a guy named Michael Murphy, who was actually the designer of the EJI Memorial, who's left Mass Design, that was the architecture firm, and he's created a new firm, Michael Murphy Studios, you all may know Michael. But the focus of that studio is building financial models around this. Yeah, and so we are working on the possibility of building a reparations fund. Like, how out of this, is there a way to do that? But we have no idea in terms of like market analysis, how much money we're even gonna be talking about. But what does it mean to do that? That's one of the reasons we also put it at Lincoln, because we wanted the revenue there, and they're now building they have like a small inn that's gonna be built there to support some of this work. But creating, again, this is the idea of a creative ecosystem that is also an economic ecosystem.
Thank you.
We're still trying to learn how to do it.
If there's a very quick question, we could probably do that, but, okay.
I just have a really quick one.
Okay, good.
You might not have the answer to this yet, but are you envisioning this entire memorial as being like free entry? And is there going to be like a ticket system, or can people just like wander in and wander out?
In terms of the first question, we don't know the answer to that, whether it's free entry. One of the things that that I've experienced here is things being free entry, that's felt good, but it's also been ticketed. And it's especially important now that if we're doing on the landscape site especially, well, on Lincoln too, you can't just have people walking in and out of a black campus. And so we're having to figure out what the safety kind of measures are, and what role does ticketing play in that, and what role is ticketing a part of the storytelling? Is there a way you can think of ticketing not just as like population management, but as like part of the experience of the story? Like, how do you do that? And we just don't know the answers to that right now.
Is the restaurant focused on profit or more like on the experience for everyone? Because I think it's quite, in my experience, eating out in the US, really expensive. So how do you make sure that everyone can experience the food? Or is it more like for people to fund the 3 sites?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it's both. Our cocktails, that we set the price point at kind of $14 to $16 for a cocktail, as no more than 25 for a cocktail, depending on the age of the spirits. No, but
For us Germans, that's like.
I know.
It's extremely expensive.
Yeah, it's extremely expensive. That $14 to $16 is kind of the market price in that area. But and so you come there for like that experience. But we also are trying to figure out how do we create experiences. The restaurant's only open Thursday to Sunday. How do you create alternative experiences that are more broadly accessible? Because we have a very clear sense that we have to fund this whole work, but we don't want to do that in a way that's exclusionary. So, for example, the Freedom's Table that you saw, where we're serving food of the kind of Star and Lantern, that's for 200 people and it's totally free. So we're trying to create, again, multiple points of access, and no one place, I think, is going to be accessible in all the same ways to everybody. But we're still trying to figure it out, and that's a great question. It's a great question.
See if it's super quick.
It's just a point for follow-up for folks. Been connected because I know you in different ways, but I thought that the Design Congress, you speak about that, was just a really brilliant way to be able to gather data. And so as a follow-up, folks are interested. It's a great story.
Yeah, we last thing. How do we actually bring people together? So we had a design congress that we put together that had historians, artists, descendants together, and we spent 3 days together taking them through sites, and together we collectively decided what we call the design principles are. What are the principles that ought to govern this? And the first question that I asked, I don't know if you remember, was, is this a good idea? Should we do this memorial? That was the very first question. It wasn't like, hey, we're doing a memorial, we want to get your input. It was like, this is a real question. Should we do this? And then the 3 days that followed from that, we left with a list of design principles that are really governing everything we're doing. So anyway, thank you so much for
Oh my
Thank
God.
you.